We're joined from DC by Liesl Hintz. She's an assistant international relations professor, Johns Hopkins University. And Kamran Bokhari also joins us from DC. He's a senior lecturer and Middle East geopolitical expert at the University of Ottawa. Kamran, let's start with you. President Erdogan had been resisting freeing Pastor Brunson. So why do you think he caved in and cut a deal and we saw the pastor released today?
Well, in the absence of any details, one can only go by the context of this development. And the context is that the Turkish economy is hurting, and the United States threatening to apply further sanctions was going to make life miserable for the Turks. So at some point, the Turks had to throw in the towel, and I suspect that that is the case. Now, we don't know, what the Turks got in exchange. Were they able to extract any benefits for themselves? I've not come across those details. But it wasn't as if the Turks were going to hold the pastor for a long time. I mean, individuals like Pastor Brunson are unfortunately, bargaining chips in the hands of powers, negotiating with each other.
Liesl, do you think that the U.S. Supporting Turkey in the situation of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi may have been a factor in this deal?
Well, it's not quite clear at this point, and it's not exactly clear the extent to which the U.S. is supporting Turkey. I think it's clear that Turkish officials have been trying to reach out to the U.S., leaking pieces of information bit by bit, particularly through their Sabah correspondent in D.C., or in the U.S., hoping that U.S. officials will make the case. Turkey is walking a very fine line with the Saudis, does not want to disrupt tensions, particularly given the economic crisis, given Saudi investment in Turkey, Saudi tourism in Turkey, and Turkish construction hopes in terms of building in Saudi. So I think that the Turks were hoping that the U.S. would place pressure on Saudi, but it's unclear the extent to which the timing of this has anything to do with Brunson's release. We know he was coming up for a hearing on October 12th. We've been waiting for this for a long time, long before Khashoggi disappeared.
Right. Kamran, the Pastor Brunson issue, I mean, that had strained relations between Washington and Ankara. Not the only issue of contention under the authoritarian regime of Erdogan. Is him being released enough to repair ties? What impact does it have on the U.S.-Turkey relations?
Well, if I had to speculate, I think that President Trump and his administration basically telegraphed President Erdogan that, look, why don't you release the pastor and then we'll talk. What that means is that this was probably the first thing that Washington wanted to see happen before they could further repair the relationship. Now, obviously, there is some confidence on the part of Ankara that Washington will actually walk that path, and therefore they released, and so they had some assurances. So I don't think that this, release of Pastor Brunson will actually, be a game changer, but it's a good start, and it seems like a good sign. But the road ahead, is not really linear.
Right. Pastor Brunson was one of more than 50,000 people arrested in Turkey in President Erdogan's huge post-coup crackdown. Erdogan has reportedly jailed over 100 journalists since the coup attempt. And here he is condemning Saudi Arabia for its treatment of dissidents for allegedly murdering Jamal Khashoggi. So we'll get into that factor after the break. Kamran and Liesl, stay with us. We want to talk more about this after the break. Welcome back to Clear Cut. The chorus of international condemnation against Saudi Arabia is growing in the disappearance of a journalist. Award-winning Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi went into his country's consulate in Turkey and has not been heard from since. Turkey now says it has video and audio that show the Saudis murdered Khashoggi. Saudi leadership vehemently denies involvement in this disappearance. Now, an advisor to President Erdogan said that they have been concerned for his safety since he went missing 10 days ago.
I was worried about his being captured, his being detained, but not to be murdered, of course. And I don't know, of course, even at this moment, we don't know whether he was murdered. And I try to, I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and to hope that he was murdered. And I try to think and that he is really not murdered, and probably he is not, of course, even if it is a very, very little possibility.
Now, also today, Turkey released U.S. pastor Andrew Bronson from house arrest. He's headed home to the U.S. after 24 months in custody. All right, for more on these diplomatic strains out of Turkey, let's bring back Kamran Bokhari and Liesl Hintz. Thank you both for rejoining us. Liesl, why would the Saudis want Khashoggi dead so badly that they would be willing to risk such a big political fallout? Or do you think perhaps that the Crown Prince, if he is indeed behind this alleged murder, just assumed that he'd be able to get away with it?
I think this is the question that we're all asking. But I think if we have to look at what Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, the Crown Prince, has been doing, he's been acting in a very reckless and aggressive manner, initiating the campaign in Yemen, the blockade against Qatar. None of these have really come to fruition, and yet he stands firmly behind them. In addition to, while supposedly being a reformer, presiding over the arrests of numerous human rights activists and so forth. So I think, in terms of perhaps testing his reach on the international stage, trying to silence one of the most networked, well-respected journalists. And I think the outpouring of support that has been shown is indicative of how well-respected and well-connected Jamal Khashoggi was. So I think the effort to try to silence this individual who had very close ties with the Saudi family, but had recently evolved into a bit of a dissident, although he didn't want to describe himself as that. So I think trying to see whether or not they could get away with silencing this individual who threatened MBS's attempts to try to reform his reputation.
Kamran, I get that Khashoggi was a very influential, world-renowned journalist. But given that this is causing such political tensions between the U.S. and Saudis, to the extent that there are calls for the U.S. to scrap an arms deal, there is speculation that it just doesn't make sense for MBS to have called for this assassination, given the collateral damage. I mean, there are many parties that have a lot to gain by sowing discord between the Saudis and the Trump administration, parties in Turkey, in Iran, and certainly in Saudi Arabia itself. A lot in the establishment have an axe to grind with him, and a lot stand to benefit for different reasons if the U.S. stops backing the Saudis in the war in Yemen, if it stops this arms deal, or if the Trump administration distances itself from MBS. So this really damages the Crown Prince's agenda on many levels. Could it maybe be a plot to frame him?
I don't know if it's a plot. That would require, a level of resources and penetration that I think, becomes really, really difficult, to say the least. For me, I don't think that this is how, the prince planned this. I think at the level of the prince, it was that something has to be done about Jamal Khashoggi, because he represented a criticism of the Crown Prince's efforts. So my view is that there was clearly a plan to abduct him. And if he has been murdered, and we don't know for sure, then the only logical explanation is that the planned abduction didn't go well. Something happened where, either he died of cardiac arrest. I mean, we've seen that happen in other cases where intelligence agents pick up journalists and, they die in custody. Or, something happened to where, there was a scuffle and perhaps he was accidentally murdered or killed. Again, I'm speculating, but I'm having a hard time believing that the Saudis would actually do this on a foreign soil and provide the incriminating evidence to frame themselves.
I mean, there is certainly something that doesn't smell quite right in all of this, given the fallout. Liesl, what action do you think the U.S. should take here?
So I think the U.S. is quite divided on this. We see Congress is threatening to invoke Magnitsky sanctions, which are invoked in terms of foreign human rights violations. But you see President Trump with a very insouciant response, saying, well, is he a U.S. citizen? Oh, he's not. And we have a lot of arms deals with the Saudis, so we don't want to put those in jeopardy. I can't see that happening. And I think that rightly so, a lot of people are calling President Trump out and saying, this is a massive human rights violation.
But
if
Lisa,
this
isn't the only massive human rights violation in Turkey. I mean, Khashoggi is not the only journalist that has disappeared in the country, as we've just discussed. Erdogan reportedly holding at least 100 journalists in prison. So,
right, but we're talking about
degree,
responding to the Saudis at this point. We're not talking about responding to the Turks.
So to what degree does the president
Saudis,
of the U.S. respond to well, not to diminish from the fact that this person allegedly got murdered, but to every person that gets killed? I mean, should the U.S. Cause a big diplomatic uproar over this one person and then not over bigger issues like perhaps the war in Yemen?
Well, I think that's actually a very good point to make, and not just the war in Yemen and the civilians that have been killed there, but the other Saudis who have been detained unjustly for speaking out against the government. And so it's unfortunate that sometimes one person becomes a bit of an example of those. But perhaps if this can begin to shed more light on what is happening in Saudi in terms of the fact that these reforms are not as transparent, as deep-rooted as MBS would like the international community to believe, then perhaps that's a good thing. But I think in terms of President Trump dismissing even, yes, this one individual's fate, I think that's indicative, of how he prioritizes business deals over human rights and also of his own disdain for the press.
Well, that's an opinion, all right. We're going to have to leave it there. Liesl Hintz and Kamran Bokhari, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.